Welcome to our chat with the expert. I'm Dr. Leanne Williams, Director of the Stanford Center for Precision Mental Health and Wellness. At Stanford, I'm also a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences, and I hold a related leadership role as Director of the Precision Medicine Core at the Palo Alto VA. I'm hosting today's chat with the expert. Through this chat series, we are showcasing the leading work of faculty members of my Center for Precision Mental Health and Wellness. The title of today's chat is Science, Precision Medicine and Translational Therapeutics. You will hear how the latest neuroscience insights are being used to develop therapeutics and to improve lives for persons experiencing obsessive compulsive disorders. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our expert, Carolyn Rodriguez, MD, PhD. Dr. Rodriguez is a Puerto Rican psychiatrist, neuroscientist, and clinical researcher, developing treatments for obsessive compulsive disorder, as well as mapping the underlying circuit mechanisms. She is a professor in the Stanford Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and directs Stanford's Translational Therapeutics Lab. Dr. Rodriguez received her Bachelor of Science in Computer Science from Harvard University, followed by an MD from Harvard Medical School, MIT, and a PhD in Neuroscience and Genetics from Harvard Medical School. Dr. Rodriguez's landmark clinical trials are pioneering rapid-acting treatments for mental illnesses that include obsessive compulsive disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. Her work spans novel medicines, neuromodulation therapies, and psychotherapy for these conditions that have been underserved by current treatments. Dr. Rodriguez also serves in many important leadership roles. She is the deputy editor of the American Journal of Psychiatry, a member of the Research Council of the American Psychiatric Association, a member of the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation Scientific Council, and a scientific and clinical advisory board member of the International OCD Foundation. Dr. Rodriguez has won several national awards, including the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers. Not surprisingly, her work has attracted much attention, including from NPR, PBS, New York Times, ABC News, NBC News, Newsweek, and Time.com. I'm thrilled to call Dr. Rodriguez a close collaborator and friend. Dr. Rodriguez is an invaluable faculty member of my Center for Precision Mental Health and Wellness. Her lab is an important allied lab of my center. I've had the rewarding opportunity to collaborate with Dr. Rodriguez over the past 8 years. These projects include a study focusing on understanding the neural mechanisms of ketamine necessary for developing therapeutics. I'm glad to be contributing my work on a neural circuit taxonomy for mental illnesses to Dr. Rodriguez's first in the world studies of novel therapeutics for OCD, spanning ketamine, nitrous oxide, and soon MDMA. On a personal note, Dr. Rodriguez and I have had many inspiring journeys together. One memorable journey was in 2019 when we both presented at the World Economic Forum in Davos. I am absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Rodriguez because we are colleagues and friends. And now we know our professional titles. We will call each other by our first names, and very much looking forward to our discussion today. Carolyn, could you perhaps tell us a bit more about your research and what you are passionate about?
Oh, definitely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. I am such an admirer of your work, and I just feel really it's like a dream come true coming to Stanford and getting a chance to work with you and collaborate with you. We know each other from way back, the Career Development Institute, and all of your wonderful work mentoring the next generation of scientists. So it's really been a delight. So as for
mutual fan.
Yeah. I would say, my interest, it wasn't until recently that I sort of just realized that in retrospect that my interest in mental illness came at a very early age. My uncle was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he would, you know, we would go over to my grandmother's house, and he would be, talking to me, but he was also talking to somebody else who
Mm.
wasn't there. And I was always fascinated with how how could it be that he was seeing something that I wasn't seeing, and just very early on curious about why people's behaviors were different, um, and how it impacted their lives. Um, and so, throughout my training, I became very interested in um, medicine, how the body worked, how the and as a natural extension of that, how the brain works. And psychiatry was incredibly appealing to me in the study of human behavior. And as I was doing my rotation, something that really struck me was seeing an individual who had to wash his hands very, very often because he was having intrusive thoughts of contamination, and to the point where he had to wear gloves out in public. And if he would take off his gloves, you would see that the hands were like just so red and raw. And it just really struck me, his suffering, his pain, and what we could do to help him. So that really took me on a trajectory of wanting to understand, as you said, the underlying mechanism of intrusive thoughts, and why people are driven to do these repetitive and compulsive behaviors, um, as well as trying to find what are new treatments, and how we can help people. So, for example, in obsessive compulsive disorder, there are, it affects around 2% of the population. Half of cases start by age 14. So people's trajectories are off very early in their lives. And about half of people will be helped by first line treatments, which is serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and half the first line treatment is serotonin reuptake inhibitors or cognitive behavioral therapy. But the other half will not be helped. And so there are other treatment pathways. And the other thing is there's a long lag time, around 2 to 3 months, for people to get this kind of clinical benefit from these two first line treatments. And so for me, that really started, a journey of trying to see if we can get people better faster. And that really started with seeing what research was done in OCD. And there was instead of serotonin reuptake inhibitors, there's things like Zoloft and sertraline. There was some excitement about drugs that change glutamate, which is the main excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain. And that paired with some animal model studies showing that if you disrupt a protein that's important in glutamate scaffolding in an animal model, you get this repetitive grooming behavior. And when you reintroduce that protein, rescuing it, they stop grooming.
Hmm.
So those two pieces of information led me to a drug called ketamine, which is a drug that was thought to act through glutamate and already had really remarkable antidepressant effects. And we conducted the first randomized controlled trial looking at in OCD patients, and found that in half of individuals, they had who got the ketamine infusion had a cessation of their intrusive thoughts, and that continued to persist out to the 1 week where we measured it, long after it had been metabolized.
That must
So
have been
that,
a really motivating experience to see that change.
yeah, absolutely. I think it was amazing at the time for me because there had never, all the glutamate kind of trials had been adding a drug onto an SSRI, and this is the first time the patients who enrolled in the study weren't on anything else. and also to see such rapid effects. So within hours, to have people say things like, I'm having a vacation from my OCD, it really, rocked my world. This is possible. And then, we really wanted to just kind of see as this like a one-off, and as you know, the importance of replication in trials, and led to the collaboration with you on this NIH-funded project.
Right. It's very inspiring how you wanting to, if I use that phrase, of like get the right treatment to the right person earlier, at the right time, rather than that waiting for several months and trial and error, and the fact that so many people are not responding from what are the standard treatments. Did you, from those early stories, which also had a big impact hearing them, it sounds like you've thought, like, how would the behaviors that are being experienced and causing such dysfunction or like difficulty in functioning in life, how are they then relating to how the brain's functioning, and how would you then use that to think about these novel therapeutics, like connecting that experience, brain, and therapeutics?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we're lucky to be in a time where there is neuroimaging and other ways to try and understand how the brain is working. If for me, it's a really critical to this kind of science and the kind of questions that you're posing and the center is posing to, work interdisciplinary methods and different modalities to try and understand, and in this project specifically that we're collaborating on, what are the mechanisms for ketamine, and how do they act clinically? And also, how is it acting in the brain? So, is it affecting a circuit in the brain? If so, which one? And so it's really helpful to have the tools that your lab is building to be able to kind of parse that out. One circuit that we've talked about and are really interested in studying together is cognitive control. So for those patients with OCD, they have this hyperactive loop in the orbitofrontal cortex in the front part of the brain, to deeper structures in the middle of the brain, the striatum and the thalamus, and then looping back. And so it's thought that patients with OCD don't have this kind of stop signal. And so that's why it's important to interrogate this the cognitive control circuit and other personalized circuits and regions of the brain to see if it's acting on that. That's one hypothesis we're testing. And also, could it be that it is actually changing levels of glutamate,
Right.
or changing inhibitory compounds such as GABA? Is it something having to do with the synchrony? Like, does ketamine, is it important to keep the nodes interconnected? Is there a disconnection between the circuits? So all of those are unanswered questions that we hope to explore.
Right. The example you're describing that struck you in your training of the gentleman needing to keep washing his hands, it really makes very tangible how a circuit like cognitive control relates to behavior if that circuit gets disrupted, because I guess we kind of take it for granted that we've got circuits that can help us regulate or control our behaviors. And yet when that gets disrupted, it can have such a profound effect on our daily function.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we all are peppered with intrusive thoughts. At times it's easier to just dismiss them, and
Right.
sometimes it's harder. So what is that? How do just, us sitting here, how do we control our thoughts? I think that remains unknown.
Right.
In fact, we don't even know how thoughts are encoded in the brain. So it's really important to partner with basic foundational and fundamental neuroscience too, to understand at the encoding level. But also, you have, I've really enjoyed your talks on depression and, the real need there. And, as we've talked about before, cognitive control is important in depression too, and that patients can have ruminative thoughts and have a lot of difficulty inhibiting those thoughts, which can impact or impinge and are associated with mood.
Yeah,
And
I think it's go ahead. Please go
no,
ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was thinking it's interesting that similar treatment trajectories are thought about for OCD and depression, like the SSRIs and ketamine. And it makes sense that there may be some overlapping or common circuit dysfunctions that involve, as you say, different kinds or forms of disruption in this cognitive control process, which may express itself as intrusive thoughts or compulsive behaviors on the one hand, or the ruminative and other types of difficulty concentrating in depression.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more that, and I think that is the beauty of your approach, right? Sort of agnostic to what are the different, sort of canonical categories. What are those regions in the brain, and what are sort of the foundational um, regions where things can go awry? And then can we use that as a building tool for therapeutics? So coming at it from the patient perspective, but also importantly looking at it from sort of an agnostic, kind of build. How do we build this up and understand it in a way that makes sense for therapeutics?
Yeah. If we get a chance in our discussion, something to circle back to, which struck me from what you were saying, that OCD can have its origins at like early in adolescence. I hadn't realized that actually.
Yes, there's a number of disorders, and I'm sorry, I know you meant to circle back to it, but also schizophrenia is also around that age. And so, as for us to circle back to is also, that's when, puberty is coming on, a lot of hormonal shifts. So, that is an incredibly understudied area. What changes in the brain to go from these like trajectories and shifts. And there's a lot of potential, I think, to understand how these circuits of cognitive control are not only affecting people now, but also how they change over time and where they go awry.
One thing that always strikes me every time I work with you, talk with you, is just how you combine being very creative and rigorous in your research, and you're really like pushing for answers that are new and making them happen. And this is kind of prefaced to a big picture question, which is, if you could wave a magic wand, what would you make happen for translational therapeutics, like for OCD or more broadly?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I love these kinds of questions, right? It sort of feels like when you're writing a grant where like everything has gone right, everything is possible in that beautiful state of grant writing. And what I would say is that that there really is a gap between this brilliant basic fundamental neuroscience, clinical neuroscience discoveries, and then the funding needed to take those ideas to ultimately get to them where we want them, right? An FDA funded new indication. I can say in the field of OCD, there hasn't been any new drugs FDA approved since the 1990s.
Wow.
And what typically can happen is that even if there's a great idea, and even if it's like repurposing already an FDA approved product, there isn't currently, clear pathways within the National Institutes of Health to conduct those kinds of studies without having like a mechanism that you're testing already. But a lot of our mental illnesses don't have, like what I was saying before, where is the thought encoded? How do we don't know those handles, or what are the best biomarkers to use right now? And then on the other side, pharmaceutical companies are, not not investing in this area as well, until things are, maybe already like, very, very far, to phase 2 or phase 3. So these sort of like fast fail discovery to try and translate those early discoveries has, a valley of discovery. And so, that's really where, foundations, donors who really get the clinical mission and the clinical importance of it are really invaluable. So if I had to wave a magic wand, it would be to get more attention, more eyes, more support on the importance of getting these compounds vetted and to a point where they could be then, in the sort of pharmaceutical pipeline in order to do larger studies that companies would feel were de-risked enough to take through the pipeline.
Got it.
I think I've said before, for every 11 compounds being tested in oncology and 8 in neurology, only 1 is being tested in psychiatry.
Sure.
So there's a big gap.
That's a huge gap, isn't it? And so it's and such a missed opportunity. What are your thoughts about what those barriers are that are, creating that chasm?
So I think it is, need for biomarkers. And I think that is where the mission of the center is really helpful. So how do we assess change? And how do we tell that a drug has worked or not? So having robust, reliable biomarkers that can be an indicator for if the target is reached or not. I think having more of those types of handles to study translational therapeutics are important. And while we're developing them, testing them in real time. So testing to see how reliable the marker is at the same time as the clinical trial is going on, as opposed to waiting to have the very robust marker, and then you can kind of do the trials. As you can tell from my tone of voice, I want to help people in our lifetime, and we need
things.
We need things now.
We really do, and I guess it's one way I'm thinking of, and some other words for what you're saying is that how do we accelerate so these advances can happen in parallel, and as you say, in our lifetime, because there's so many advances in our field in psychiatry that are exciting, and I feel like not yet known, and potentially not known enough by the general community, that there is a lot of opportunity, new advances, and a need to have a very united effort to accelerate.
Lee, may I have another wave at the magic wand?
Please, I think you get at least 3. Yes.
I don't know if it's like an Aladdin situation, like how many I get. Anyway, the other I would say is venues for collaborative research. Yeah. So one of the great joys of doing science, granted, there's many frustrations about doing science, but one of the joys is being in an environment where you have this like amazing sandbox to play in, like great partners to play with, and to have that room and space and creativity scientifically to do work together that isn't necessarily always hypothesis driven, but is giving you information on how to formulate exciting and important new hypotheses. And, I really respect the vision of your center and wanting to have partners who are focused in different areas and really creating a space for that work to happen together. It's, to me, that's where the most exciting science is.
Yeah, I really appreciate that feedback. And I'm always motivated by the interactions, across like collaborators directly in our field and then other fields. It's where the spark usually happens. And then, it's very difficult to make advances as one lab, one PI. It literally takes a village of, committed people. So
Can I have
Do you
a
want
third
another
one?
wave?
Third one? Okay.
Yeah.
Third one I would say is support for junior folks,
Mhm.
right? Folks that are coming in. There's a lot of tough environment with the pandemic. A lot of new faculties are joining institutions that they've never been in before, and just really creating ways to help those junior folks have as long a runway as possible, so that they continue to be energized, they continue to be motivated. A lot of folks have had to stop their research. It's been not as conducive to meeting new people and having these kinds of interactions. So I think the more that we can keep people excited and motivated so that they can kind of get to the light at the end of the tunnel where they're at a new institution generating data, you know, getting their thoughts out into the universe.
Yeah.
Just more support and time for junior
Yeah.
folks.
So important. So this is now jumping to a slightly more specific question, and I'm sure will be on people who are listening, maybe coming into their mind, is you said there haven't been new therapeutics for OCD or approved by FDA since the 1990s. So what are the current therapeutics for OCD, and how do the new ones get developed?
There are, some industry sponsored studies of glutamate modulators, and we're a site on one of those studies. And there's been studies that are like more like one-offs, like one site has done, a randomized study that looked promising, but it needs to be sort of replicated. There, one avenue that you had mentioned before is, at least in the OCD community, there's so much interest in psychedelics, and pathogens, ketamine, these kinds of things that are sort of new mechanisms of action. And one of the studies that we're collaborating on is on MDMA, which is an empathogen that could be a nice window into helping to improve cognitive behavioral therapy. And at the same time, it's important, as we've talked about before, to have equipoise in terms of, could this be helpful? Yes, but if it's not helpful, we would like to know that as soon as possible so that we can let people know, as opposed to trying some of these things. But again, that involves like thoughtful research design, funding, trying to conduct these studies, and that can be a wonderful opportunity and a challenge.
Yeah. No, we really want to get the message out about there's exciting advances and they really need support. From what you're saying about the new therapeutics, they're coming along the pipeline, but they may not be right for everybody. So to me, that's a point that can be lost when there's excitement about a new therapeutic.
Absolutely. Yep.
And because we want to make a difference, and there's many people who are themselves, their families, they're desperate for new solutions. But when we hear about a new therapeutic, very often it's seen as this is a one size fits all, potentially, for a particular disorder or illness. So what are your thoughts around how do we think about that as being maybe more personalized or suited to individuals?
Absolutely. And, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? Which is, as a clinician, it would be wonderful to apply a test or have a marker or something in hand that I can use in the office to try and determine which type of first line treatment would be helpful. So again, 50% of people are helped. So is it better to start with a serotonin reuptake inhibitor? Is it better to start with cognitive behavioral therapy? And where are those markers or indicators to help you make the difference. And even more would be which of the medications would be helpful.
Right.
And so I again very much admire the center and your lab's work on trying to be able to have those real world low cost ways of determining this.
Is your sense that when you're translating the findings to your clinical work, is your sense that it also is potentially helpful for the patients and families to have the tests that would say, or the markers, the biomarkers, the tests available to say this therapy might work for you, or there's evidence from the test it might work, as a form of like an action plan or a treatment journey that makes it tangible? It's like, we have this indication from the test, it may be useful to try this therapy, and then it's an action plan, so to speak, or a patient journey that might be more familiar to people in other areas of medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think personalized approaches in cancer, for example, for chemotherapy are really important, and I absolutely a big fan of collaborative decision making and thinking about the options. One thing that we ask patients in terms of SSRIs is any family members, with a condition, what have they tried in the past? And you can kind of, if there's a family member who's responded well to Lexapro or escitalopram or paroxetine, then you want to know that, so that that person has all the information. If you have this family member that has been helped with it, then we want to start there.
That's really interesting. So would you think of that as the mechanisms for the therapies being specific to the individual, potentially, or subgroups of people?
I think the jury is out, at least for OCD. I think that's where the need is, to try and understand those deeper questions.
So speaking of deeper questions, what would be your next dream project? I know you have a really exciting one for MDMA coming up, but maybe even beyond that one.
Yeah, one of the projects that we're doing now, also in collaboration with you, is sponsored with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and trying to look at this idea of like cognitive control, but coming at it from suicidality. So people have these intrusive suicidal thoughts. And in the study, we're looking at 200 individuals, half that have had a past history of suicidal behavior and half who've not, and trying to see if we could remotely administer these cognitive batteries, so that we can tell what, kind of the predictive piece that we were talking about, like who might, depending on their cognitive control level, go on to have a suicide behavior, and who doesn't. So what is a differentiating factor? And if we could make a dent in doing these kind of studies remotely, right? I think that would be, to me, really exciting, to do as many studies as we can that reach as many people in rural settings, that can have this dual function of trying to understand, how do we reach people remotely so they don't have to be going somewhere else? How do we at the same time educate them, because we're providing suicide resources and plans and suicide safety plans for them, and so that to me, that's the dream, right? Like doing the science, doing outreach, helping people get connected to care, and trying to do things as remotely and as far reaching as possible.
And literally life-changing. And it highlights, to me, another area that may not be immediately apparent, across the general community, about just how important this concept of cognitive control or cognitive processing is. Because the suicidal thoughts, intrusive thoughts, and then making the decision to act on them, I think is really confronting, understandably, to everybody, and to try and understand, like, why might it be that those thoughts are intrusive, and what does make the difference in preventing the action. That's where thinking about circuits like cognitive control, or how do you even understand them, can make such a difference, but may not be naturally what is thought of as being the way to make a difference. So I'm wondering if you have ideas just to expand on that a little more. Like, I'm aware of evidence for depression that is, what wouldn't normally be thought of is depression in up to 1/3 of people goes hand in hand with difficulties in decision making or inhibiting thoughts, as we were talking about before. Sometimes a lot of problems concentrating, and that profile can make it even harder to manage. Like, if it feels like, I can't actually see a reason to live, having those challenges may make it easier to have the intrusive suicidal thought. So for OCD, is it a potentially a similar process, or are you thinking more broadly transdiagnostically?
Yeah. We're collecting that information as well. And I think to circle back to the what we had talked about before, my hypothesis is that there are these like foundational and underlying structures, and that the manifestation of them outward, right, with symptoms of different varieties, like it can look different, but there's certain features of groups of disorders that seem to have the same kind of perseverative thoughts, thoughts that can't be controlled. And if there's a way to see what that is, see its predictive value, see how it acts on the pathology, it would be a way to open new therapeutics that's targeting not just the grouping of the symptoms, but at that sort of fundamental or foundational brain level.
Right. And is your sense that we are at the point in knowing about the brain and behavior and those kind of experiences that we really are able to start to explain those connections and make them available for therapy? And what I'm getting at is, we've for many years had a reasonable understanding of the structure of the brain, like anatomically, the basis of neurology. But now, like, thanks to, say, Human Connectome Project, we're kind of mapping the functional connections of the brain as well. How is it actually functioning and processing information, regulating our emotions, giving us a sense of our daily experience, our memories. It's like, so it's the functional operations of the brain, so to speak, and that give us that experience day by day, moment by moment, and then produce our behaviors, or our behaviors influence it. Do you feel like that those breakthroughs in understanding the functioning of the brain are giving us more traction for psychiatry?
Yeah, actually, your question made me think of do you remember that moment where like Watson and Crick discovered the DNA, and like it was like, we're gonna cure everything, and then it's sort of like, wait a second, we have to like figure out what each of these,
what do they
what's
mean?
the function. It's not enough to know what the map is. We also have to know in what proportions, and then there's like the exon the like other parts of the DNA that inhibit and silence parts of the proteins from being expressed. So it sort of feels like that, which is like, we know some parts of the puzzle, which allow us then, I would say conservatively, to take the next step, which is how do structure and function go together?
Right.
And so there's the promise of unraveling, the key secrets. But to me, what's more exciting is the next step, which is like how do we uncover and uncode what these things mean together.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. No, I absolutely relate to the excitement around that. One of my questions was going to be, why is the work in this field so hard? But now we're on such a positive series of thoughts. I don't know if you want to go back to that question or we move ahead to another one. Maybe we could reframe it, like,
yeah.
because you touched before on what it would take, or ideally what it would take when you wave your 3 magic wands to make it all possible. Is there perhaps there's something you wanted to add to that, or like, are there any more even like on the ground kind of challenges that having a center that attracts funding for your work could make a difference?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I think certainly part of it is, is support, having the right environment, and also just, like frame shift, um, the incentives and excitement, right? So, what, uh, again, their challenges are all around us, but really tapping into that
Right.
excitement of discovery, um, and the fun of being part of something that's larger that you can't just do by yourself, and the cross fertilization of
Yeah.
it. So I think maybe I answered that as a positive.
Right. No, I love
Still,
that. Well, you always
it's
convey
hard to
the
get me down,
excitement.
Lee.
It really is. I can attest to that. You're always generate the excitement for the work as well, in addition to it being very rigorous. And I think that is a very special set of skills and qualities. Is there any finding that's got you especially excited at the moment, or set of findings?
Well, we just finished our ketamine study and we have unblinded it, so I'm going through the data. So it's always
Okay.
fun to have data, but I can't say just yet. So stay
Okay.
tuned.
We'll
Stay
have a
tuned for
second chat and
what we're
spotlight the
finding.
findings.
And just early data on the nitrous oxide and OCD, which is really interesting. But again, I think, stay tuned. So I think
Okay.
what's exciting me is just, um, you know, that patients are willing to, we are in a global pandemic
Right.
still.
Right.
The patients are willing to take a leap of faith with us, continue to help us crack the code, um, and are also as equally interested in the science and
Yeah.
contributing. And unfortunately, we can't thank them, uh, you know, individually or publicly. Everything has to remain confidential, and yet those are people who are really, um, you know, making it possible to
Right.
understand more about the brain.
Right. Yeah. That really impacts me as well, what you're highlighting there. So thinking of it from the patient perspective and families, what do you think's needed to get the new therapies into practice?
Mhm. Well, I think, just taking a step back, this moment, in our within the pandemic was highlighted just the tremendous need for mental health that was there
Yeah.
before, and post pandemic, how much even more, help is needed, for individuals. So I would say more than ever, we want, just campaigns for, trying to get people to connected to health and not let, um, you know, uh, um, personal, feelings about stigma
Mhm.
or other barriers, to get into care. Um, and I think messaging around that is really important. Like really, um, I like to tell patients, like, if you, if your uncle had a heart attack, you wouldn't say like, oh, it's all in your head, or
Right.
like, the assumption would be that you would go to a doctor and you would
Right.
get care. And so why do we think any differently about mental illness?
So a lot
And
of blame in, like, or assumption that it's some perhaps a character flaw or weakness. You should just try harder. Those themes are still
yeah,
there.
and I think changing the way we approach it, normalizing it, getting the word out is one important way. I would say also like increasing funding for
Mhm.
schools, also to have more counselors and resources available for mental
Right.
health. So getting mental health into the community, and more at point of contact. There's a lot of cool research of mental health in like religious settings, schools, venues where people are in the communities,
Right.
right? And I think part of that is really exciting in terms of like scaling. And I know scaling is something that is near and dear to your heart.
Mhm.
Like how, not just what is happening, but how do we scale it and how do we
Yes.
get it to people?
Yeah. And you're a great advocate for outreach. It strikes me when you think about schools, that your point about how do we, make this part of the almost the education process of learning about mental health and how does your brain work. We do take it for granted that we learn about other aspects of navigating life, like road safety, or look left and right when you're crossing the road, but we
Yeah.
we don't yet, as we're growing up, have a way of saying, look, these are ways that your brain works, and everyone has a different configuration of their brain, and what you think about and what you do will interact, as a way of potentially building coping strategies, because you know how your individual brain is wired to start with, and knowing that it can change. It, it strikes me that could be potentially useful
Mhm.
for young people, just to have that sense of themselves from that perspective.
Mhm. Mhm. Absolutely. And I think, it's increasingly schools are including a social and emotional development component, which I think
Right.
is really critical. And at the same time, the counselors and are just overwhelmed, right?
Yes.
There's just a lot going on for young people. Um, and we need, as a field, we need to help meet that capacity and get creative about ways to reach people.
Yeah. And your point about funding, I think, can't be overemphasized, because the numbers that you cited before that are so staggering, the number of compounds that make it through to being used for other areas of medicine, how small it is by comparison in psychiatry, and how small is the funding as well, or how much less is the funding proportionally. So it there's a lot that could be done to really accelerate, including the outreach. So maybe we should take a long view now, with the last couple of related questions. Is, what are your thoughts about opportunities looking forward? Like, what would be your hope for the future of our field, for the next generation in our field? You've touched on early career investigators. And then what do you think therapeutics for OCD and the other areas that you are expert in might look like in 20 years or even beyond that?
Um, this is a great question. Again, I love these questions. So, we are at Stanford, Silicon Valley. There's a lot of hope for technology and ways of, at higher levels and with artificial intelligence, being able to look at large data. And I know you have, published extensively and given lots of talks on big data. So I'm actually I think you're probably better equipped to opine on this. But to me, the brain, like as opposed to the kidney, right? Where we could maybe on the hands, two hands, say the types of cells that are there. The neuron is
Yeah.
a whole
More
other
than
level
them.
of
Yeah.
complexity. And, in 20 years, I'm optimistic that infusing and automating um, the things that we're doing sort of more manually now and at larger capacity, we'll be able to understand more, not just point A to point B, but what are the different interrelationships, and can we um, decrease the temporal time scale? Like, can we get more information instead of 13-minute chunks with magnetic resonance
Right.
spectroscopy? Can you do MRS, like looking at different neurotransmitter, but at faster scale? Like,
Mhm.
could it be at the scale of an EEG? We are having thoughts all the time. So
Yes.
how do we read that? How do we don't currently have the tools to sort of decrease that in a way, for at the molecular level. So working with our partners who do positron emission tomography, labeling specific cells and being able to do that neuroimaging in real time, partnering with neurosurgeons, partnering with neurologists who are having implanted devices that can look at, again, shorter time scales, and really thinking about very closely how the brain is changing over shorter periods of time, and in vivo, I think, is where, and with the artificial intelligence, to be able to take in that level of information, I think will be the future.
Right. Timing is everything when it comes to the brain, I think. Yeah. Really fast timescales. Do you, in thinking of that, um, like making the technology, real time, thinking about the big data, could you imagine that in that, maybe not in the 20 years timescale, but we do want to make that happen, that we could use that information to get closer to personalizing the therapeutic selection, or at least informing that process if we had more real-time data available to us and made use of machine learning and AI to actually synthesize that information also more in real time? Then it'd be more like tools available to the clinician.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a burgeoning literature of closed loop systems and like different hardware to sort of like detect a pattern and then to be able to stimulate it in real time, and having, you know, the foundational work that you're doing, Lee, to say like, well, what should we be looking for, right? Like, what are we detecting, is key to then being able to harness those technological advancements to then take it to the next level.
Right. I feel like I could talk for hours and hours and hours. I love this discussion and all our discussions. I'm respectful of your time, so I'm wondering, do you have would you like to kind of give our listeners a summary wrap up?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation and just an opportunity to, within our busy days, just really
Yes.
reflect on the future. And that's something that I think is important, again, for like junior faculty and folks who are entering the field, taking time to, within your schedule, to reflect and think about the future and really strategize what things energize you, what things are important for patients, and really centering patient experience in everything that we're doing, and making time to speak to really thoughtful leaders in the fields like yourself. It's really refreshing, and motivating to the work that we do every day.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.